Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today is on lectures 3 and 4 in seminar 2. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. How does the unconscious emerge from the symbolic? 2. What is the ego's function in relation to the unconscious and consciousness? 3. How does the subject identify with the ego? If you learned something from this video and wish to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. Lectures 3 and 4 are conceptually dense. They also overlap with material covered in Seminar 1, but with some notable distinctions and nuances. I'll focus our analysis on what's new, or how what is being presented adds to what came before. So our first question is, how does the unconscious emerge from the symbolic? The concept of the symbolic is introduced here following a lecture delivered by Levi-Strauss, who wrote the book The Elementary Structures of Kinship, published in 1949. Elementary structures consist of networks of commands, indications, and prohibitions. They specify who a person should marry and how such marriages should enact exchanges among different social groups. These rules form a system that intervenes and orders the human world. It's an emergent function not found in nature, but operates in every aspect of life so as to seem as if it were natural. As such, it imposes itself as a totality, a symbolic universe that structures our entire existence. Lacan also calls the symbolic the world of the machine. It's an impersonal, unindividuated function that one is inside of. And Lacan emphasizes that one's inside of the symbolic rather than the symbolic being inside of us. The idea of the machine also communicates the automaticity by which it operates. The symbolic does not have to be put into action. It always already is functioning. It operates differently than the animal, which Lacan calls a jammed machine, which operates with a narrow set of operations strictly determined by demands of the external environment. The machine associated with the human symbolic is thought of as something closer to a kind of information processing model dealing with inputs, computational processes, and outputs. The important point here is that it's a much more dynamic machine than that of the animal. There are elements of one's history pertaining to desire that are not structured by the symbolic in an integrated fashion. This gives rise to the unconscious subject. It's created when the symbolic meets with those elements of one's history resistant to symbolization, forming what Lacan calls here the core of our being, and what he called in Seminar 1 the pathogenic nucleus. The core of our being functions like a gap or hole around which we form our experiences. Elsewhere, it will be conceptualized as the missing signifier around which life becomes organized. The unconscious is the element unknown to the ego, or more accurately, it is misrecognized by the ego. Here it finally becomes clear that the nucleus is not the ego, rather the ego is what misrecognizes this core of our being. So this leads us to our second question. What is the ego's function in relation to the unconscious and consciousness? We can now better appreciate the function of the ego as the source of resistance to recognizing the unconscious. Lacan defines the ego here as the sum of the prejudices which any knowledge comprises, and which each of us has as individual baggage. It is something which includes what we know or think we know, for knowing is always in some way believing one knows. Let's consider how prejudices work. As the word suggests, they are judgments made in advance of some incoming information. When applied to people, these prejudgments tend to shape our experience of others, what we pay attention to, and what we remember. Prejudices can also lead us to distorted interpretations of what we do observe, and are generally resistant to information that contradicts our pre-existing beliefs. We might think of the ego as a kind of mechanism that facilitates confirmation bias. In the present context, the ego's prejudices are toward the unconscious, leading to both resistance and misrecognition. Notice that we don't say that the unconscious goes unrecognized, but rather misrecognized, meaning a distortion and not just simple ignorance. Resistance to a genuine recognition of the unconscious happens because such recognition would entail a decentering of that ego, moving it off its habitual center. Now, the odd thing here is that what is being misrecognized is none other than what founds the ego in the first place, the subject. The ego is that part of the subject that the subject is fixated upon. It is the fundamental central structure of our experience. Related to this is that the ego gets perceived as the unity of consciousness itself. Despite this, however, the ego is not equivalent to consciousness. And here Lacan gives us a better understanding of what consciousness is. And to understand his analysis here, it would be helpful to look back at the optical schema. Though it's not explicitly mentioned here, much of what Lacan says regarding consciousness and the ego continues to map onto this schema. If we recall, we have this curved mirror here, which was identified by Lacan in Seminar 1 as the cortex. Here he elaborates upon this idea by suggesting that the area striata of the occipital lobe is exactly like a mirror. Consciousness is then the reflected image of this mirror. Hence, Lacan provides us with what he considers to be a materialist definition of consciousness, which is the title of Lecture 4. What is perceived within the field of consciousness is the object of the ego. Now, this ego resides in an imaginary space, projecting as an alienated virtual unity. This is what we saw in the case of the bouquet and flowers, which form that unity when perceived at the right angle, as the real images bounce off the concave mirror off the cortex. Elsewhere, he states that the ego's relation with consciousness is one of tension, which later in the seminar he will state is a tension between the ego as alienated from the subject and the purely perceptual dimension of consciousness that escapes the ego. To better understand the relation between the subject and the ego, Lacan offers an apologue of the blind man and the paralytic. The paralytic is the subject prior to its identification with the ego. For us humans, there's already a crack, a profound perturbation of the regulation of life. That fragmentation concerns not only the lack of mastery over our bodily movements, but also our desire, which is not so neatly structured out of the gate as it is for the animal. In this situation, the paralytic looks out to the world and becomes fascinated by the blind man, who is ambulating throughout his environment just fine. This other displays the kind of unity of bodily experience that the paralytic wishes for itself, and out of that desire acquires a profound fascination with the other's image. The blind man is the ego, who is the master of the paralytic, carrying him around. The use of the word fascination is very appropriate here. Etymologically, to fascinate comes from the word fascinare, meaning to bewitch or enchant. And its earliest uses were applied to witches and serpents that could cast a spell by a look that rendered one unable to move or resist. Also, it's related to the Latin word fascinum, meaning human penis or artificial phallus. Lacan has yet to address the concept of the phallus in these seminars, but let's keep that in mind as a question concerning the relation between that symbol and the ego, an ego which is not only a function but also is a symbol itself. The critical point in considering the relation of the ego and the subject is that they are not equivalent. Rather, the ego is an object within the experience of the subject. Whenever I say I am ... we're identifying with the ego. The ... is always the me. So we always are saying I am me, even if I'm saying I am a professor, I am a father, I am a son. This is easier to grasp in the French, since what we call the ego is often named le moi in French, the me. This is the pronoun we use to refer to ourselves as an object, like that is me. What is important here is not the grammatical dimension of it, however, but the function it plays in the life of the subject. Lacan's point is that the I that says I am me, or again, I am a son or I am a father, that I that says I am me is not the same as the me. even though it is what the I identifies with at that moment. With that, we'll end today. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.